The Volthy Collective had ruled the telepathic arts for 12,000 cycles. And in all that time, they had never encountered a mind they could not read, could not understand, could not break apart and study like a simple puzzle waiting to be solved. High Mind Weaver Civilith stood at the observation window of the Serenity of Thought, his four eyes narrowing as he watched the damaged vessel drift closer to their ship. The craft was small, primitive, covered in burn marks and impact craters that told a story of desperate survival against impossible odds. "What species?" he asked, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had spent 300 cycles perfecting the art of mental invasion. His assistant, a young mind weaver named Korath, checked the scanner readings and felt his stomach tighten with something he could not quite name. "Human, High Mind Weaver. They come from a planet called Earth in the Orion Spur region." Civilith's thin lips curled into what might have been a smile. Humans were new to the galactic community, barely a century into space travel, still stumbling around like children taking their first steps into a vast and dangerous universe. "Bring the vessel into our docking bay," Civilith commanded, already imagining the scientific papers he would publish, the recognition he would receive for being the first to map a human mind. "I want any survivors brought to the medical wing immediately." The retrieval took less than an hour. And when the security team finally cut through the damaged hull, they found only one survivor among the wreckage, a young human female, unconscious, floating in the zero gravity with her arms wrapped around an emergency beacon she had been trying to activate when the power failed. They carried her to the medical wing, and Civilith watched through the glass as the medical drones began their scans. The results made him lean forward with intense curiosity. The human's body was a map of survival. Healed fractures in her ribs, her left arm, her right collarbone. Chemical burns on her hands that had scarred over and healed and scarred again. Muscle density that suggested a lifetime of physical labor. And stress hormones flooding her bloodstream at levels that would have killed a Volthy in minutes. "She has been fighting since the day she was born," Korath whispered, genuine awe creeping into his voice despite his training. Civilith dismissed the observation with a wave of his long fingers. "All Deathworld species are like this. Their planets try to kill them every moment of every day, so they adapt or they die. It is simple evolution, nothing more." But even as he said the words, something about the human unsettled him in a way he could not explain. Her face, even in unconsciousness, carried lines of exhaustion that seemed far too deep for someone so young. And her hands, scarred and calloused, twitched occasionally as if reaching for something or someone that was no longer there. The medical drones finished their scan and projected her file from the ship's recovered manifest. Her name was Sarah Chun, and her profession made Civilith pause for just a moment. Emergency First Responder, Paramedic Search and Rescue Division. "What does this mean?" Korath asked, unfamiliar with human occupational titles. Civilith accessed the galactic database and read the definition. It appears she was trained to enter dangerous situations and retrieve injured or dying members of her species. She ran toward disasters while others ran away. Why would anyone choose such a life? "Because humans are primitive," Civilith answered, though the words felt hollow even to him. "They have not yet evolved past their base instincts. They feel compelled to help each other in ways that more advanced species have long abandoned as inefficient." Korath looked at the unconscious human with new eyes. Her scars suddenly seemed less like marks of weakness and more like medals earned in battles that most beings would never have the courage to fight. "I Mind Weaver," he said carefully. "Perhaps we should wait until she wakes. Perhaps we should ask her permission before we perform the deep reading." Civilith turned to stare at his assistant with all four eyes, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Ask permission? From an animal?" "The Volthy Collective has mapped over 900 species. Korath, we do not ask, we take." That is our right as the superior beings of this galaxy. But the neural density readings are unlike anything we have seen before. Korath pressed, pulling up the data on his display. Our brain activity is nearly triple the norm for similar-sized species. There are patterns here that our systems cannot even categorize. All the more reason to study her. Civilith countered, his excitement growing. Imagine what we might learn from such a unique specimen. Imagine the secrets locked away in that primitive skull. He walked to the communication panel and summoned his circle. 6 of the finest mind-weavers in the collective. Each one trained in the art of mental invasion. Each one eager to prove themselves worthy of Civilith's favor. They arrived within minutes, their robes flowing behind them like shadows given form. They gathered around the unconscious human, joining their hands in the ritual formation that would allow them to combine their psychic strength. Korath stood apart from the circle, his heart beating with a rhythm of warning that he could not silence. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong, and every instinct he possessed screamed at him to stop this before it was too late. But he was young, and Civilith was powerful, and the Volthy had never encountered a mind they could not conquer. Begin the deep reading, Civilith commanded, and the circle closed their eyes as one. Their combined consciousness rose like a great wave and crashed against the shores of the human's mind, pushing past her defenses with the ease of predators who had never known what it meant to be prey. They expected a garden. All minds were gardens to the Volthy, filled with simple thoughts and simpler emotions, easily navigated and effortlessly harvested. But Sarah Chun's mind was no garden. As the mind-weavers pushed deeper, the last thing Korath heard before the screaming began was Civilith's voice, stripped of all its arrogance, reduced to a single word of pure and absolute terror. No. And then the darkness swallowed them all. The first thing Civilith noticed was the silence. A thick, heavy silence that pressed against his consciousness like a weight he could not lift. The minds of other species always had some kind of background noise, the gentle hum of thoughts and memories playing like distant music. But here, in this gray void, there was nothing. He reached out to his circle, felt their presences beside him like flickering candles in an endless night. They were all here, all 7 of them, floating in the empty space of the human subconscious. "This is wrong," one of the mind-weavers whispered, her voice trembling. Where are her thoughts? Where are her memories? Civilith opened his mouth to respond, to reassure them that everything was under control, that they simply needed to push deeper, and then the screaming began. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that was not truly a sound, but a feeling, a memory. A moment of pure terror ripped from the human's past and thrust upon them with the force of a collapsing star. The gray void shattered. Suddenly, they were somewhere else, a city street covered in dust and debris, and the sky above them was filled with smoke. Buildings had fallen. Cars were overturned, and everywhere, there were bodies. Civilith tried to pull back, tried to retreat to the safety of his own mind, but something held him in place. Something in the human subconscious had detected the invasion and responded not with fear, not with submission, but with the primal aggression of a creature that had survived a world designed to kill it. "She is fighting us!" Korath shouted, his mental voice cracking with panic. But Civilith barely heard him, because his attention was fixed on the figure moving through the rubble, a younger version of Sarah Chun. Her face covered in blood and dust, her hands torn and bleeding as she dug through broken concrete with her bare fingers. She was searching for something, and her desperation was so intense that Civilith could feel it burning through his own consciousness like acid. Then she found it, a small hand, reaching up through the debris. A child. Sarah grabbed the hand and pulled, ignoring the way the broken concrete tore at her skin. She pulled and pulled until the child emerged, a boy no older than 5 or 6, his face gray and still. He was not breathing. Sarah did not hesitate, did not pause. did not waste a single second on despair. She laid the child on the ground and began pushing on his chest, counting under her breath, forcing air into lungs that did not want to work. Civilith heard the crack of breaking ribs beneath her palms, felt her horror at the sound, felt her determination override that horror and keep pushing anyway. "Come on," she whispered, and Civilith realized with a shock that he could hear her thoughts, feel her emotions, experience everything she had experienced in this moment. Come on, breathe for me. Please breathe for me." The child coughed, sputtered, and began to cry. Sarah gathered him in her arms and held him tight, and for just a moment, Civilith felt something he had never felt before, a fierce, burning joy that came not from receiving but from giving, from saving, from pulling a life back from the edge of oblivion. But the moment passed and another memory seized them. Now they were in a car wreck, metal twisted and glass shattered, and Sarah was kneeling beside a woman whose injuries were too severe for anyone to survive. The woman was crying, asking about her daughter, begging to know if her little girl was okay. Sarah looked to her left, where another paramedic was covering a small body with a white sheet. The daughter had not survived. But when Sarah turned back to the dying woman, her face showed nothing but calm reassurance. "She is okay," Sarah said, her voice steady even as her heart shattered inside her chest. "She is safe. You did so good. She is going to be just fine." The woman smiled, relief flooding her fading eyes, and then she was gone. Civilith felt the weight of that lie settle into Sarah's soul like a stone. He felt her carry it, added to the countless other stones she already bore. And he understood, with growing horror, that this was not a memory she was ashamed of. She was proud of it. She had given a dying mother peace in her final moments, had spared her the agony of knowing her child was dead. The lie had been an act of mercy, and Sarah would carry its weight forever without complaint. The mind-weavers tried again to withdraw, but the memories kept coming faster and faster, each one more intense than the last. A house fire, flames everywhere, Sarah carrying an elderly man down a collapsing staircase while her skin blistered and burned. A flood, muddy water rising, Sarah diving again and again to pull trapped survivors from submerged vehicles. A factory explosion, Sarah working for 16 hours straight, her hands never stopping, her voice never wavering, even as bodies piled up around her. And through it all, one question echoed in Civilith's mind. Why? Why did she do this to herself? Why did she choose a life of constant pain and trauma? Why did she not simply walk away and let others suffer? The answer came not in words but in feelings, a tidal wave of emotion that crashed against the mind-weavers with the force of a planetary collision. Because someone had to. Because every life was worth saving. Because giving up was not an option, had never been an option, would never be an option, as long as Sarah-chan drew breath. The Volthy had never encountered anything like this. They processed emotions by releasing them, by letting go of pain and trauma so it could not weigh them down. But humans, these impossible, irrational humans, did the exact opposite. They held on. They carried their grief like armor, their pain like weapons, their memories of the dead like sacred treasures that could never be abandoned. And Sarah-chan had been carrying these weights for years, decades, a lifetime of loss and triumph and heartbreak and hope, all compressed into a single unbreakable will. Korath fell first, his young mind unable to withstand the onslaught. He collapsed out of the memory and back into his own body, gasping and sobbing and clutching his head. One by one, the other mind-weavers followed, ripped from the human's consciousness and thrown back into reality like leaves in a hurricane. But Civilith remained, trapped in the deepest part of Sarah's mind, surrounded by the ghosts of everyone she had ever lost. And as the darkness closed in around him, he finally understood what made humans so terrifying. It was not their strength or their aggression or their primitive technology. It was their refusal to stop caring, even when caring destroyed them from the inside out. Korath opened his eyes and found himself on the cold metal floor of the medical wing, his body shaking so violently that he could not control his own limbs. Beside him, two other Mindweavers lay unconscious, their faces twisted into expressions of pure terror that sleep could not erase. He tried to stand, but his legs would not obey. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as nothing more than a broken whimper. And every time he closed his eyes, even for a second, the memories came flooding back. The burning house, the collapsing staircase, the weight of a dying man in Sarah's arms. He forced his eyes open and dragged himself across the floor toward the observation window, desperate to see something, anything, that was not pulled from the nightmare of the human's mind. Through the glass, he could see the containment pod where Sarah Chen lay motionless, her vital signs still stable despite the psychic assault that had just torn through 7 of the most powerful telepaths in the collective. And standing at the foot of her pod, his entire body rigid with shock, was High Mindweaver Civilith. Korath had known Civilith for 30 cycles. He had seen the High Mindweaver face down hostile species, navigate deadly political situations, and break the minds of prisoners without showing a single sign of emotion. But now Civilith was shaking. His 4 eyes were wide and unfocused, staring at something that only he could see. His hands trembled at his sides, and his lips moved constantly, forming words in a language Korath did not recognize. "High Mindweaver," Korath called out, his voice finally returning, though it sounded weak and broken. "High Mindweaver, can you hear me?" Civilith did not respond. Korath pulled himself up using a medical cart for support and stumbled toward the High Mindweaver. When he finally reached him, he placed a hand on Civilith's shoulder and immediately wished he had not. The touch created a connection, and through that connection, Korath caught a glimpse of what Civilith was still experiencing. Not a memory this time, but something far worse. Sarah Chun's subconscious had not simply expelled Civilith. It had trapped him in the deepest part of her mind, the place where all her pain lived, the graveyard where she kept the memories of everyone she had ever lost. And there were so many of them. Korath saw faces flash past, men, women, children, elderly, young, healthy, sick. Hundreds of faces, maybe thousands. Each one carrying a name that Sarah had memorized, a story that Sarah had witnessed, a death that Sarah had fought against with every fiber of her being. Some of them she had saved. Some of them she had lost. But all of them, every single one, she remembered. This was the true horror of the human mind. Not the violence, not the trauma, not even the pain. It was the fact that humans refused to forget. The Volthy had evolved to release painful memories, to let them fade into nothingness so they could move forward unburdened. But humans did the exact opposite. They clung to their pain, treasured it, built monuments to it inside their own skulls. Sarah Chun did not carry her trauma because she could not let go. She carried it because she chose to, because forgetting the dead would have been a betrayal worse than death itself. Korath pulled his hand away from Civilith and staggered backward, his mind reeling from what he had seen. Why? He whispered to no one in particular. Why would anyone choose to live like this? And then, impossibly, he heard an answer. Not from Civilith, not from the other Mindweavers, but from Sarah Chun herself, her consciousness reaching out from across the room, touching his mind with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the violence they had just experienced. Because they mattered. Sarah's voice echoed in his head, tired and sad but unbroken. Every single one of them mattered. And as long as I remember them, as long as I carry them with me, they are not truly gone. Korath felt tears streaming down his face, an involuntary response that Volthy rarely experienced. "The weight," he said out loud, though he knew she could hear his thoughts. How do you carry so much weight and still function? How do you wake up every morning knowing that all of that pain is waiting for you? The answer came not in words, but in images. He saw Sarah waking up in a small apartment, her body aching from old injuries that never fully healed. He saw her putting on her uniform, checking her equipment, drinking bitter coffee that did little to ease her exhaustion. He saw her walking into the rescue station, greeting her colleagues with a smile that hid the darkness beneath. He saw her climbing into her vehicle, answering calls, running toward disasters that everyone else fled. And he saw the moment that made it all worthwhile, the moment when she pulled a survivor from the wreckage, when she held a child's hand and promised that everything would be okay, when she watched someone walk out of the hospital who should have died. Those moments were rare, far rarer than the failures. But they were enough. They were enough to justify the pain, the sleepless nights, the memories that haunted her every waking moment. They were enough to keep her going when giving up would have been so much easier. "You are insane," Korath whispered, but there was no contempt in his voice, only wonder. "Your entire species is insane." He felt Sarah's amusement ripple through the connection, tired and faint but genuine. "Maybe," she admitted. "But we are also alive, and so are the people we save." That is not insanity, that is purpose. The connection faded, and Korath found himself alone in his own mind once again. He looked at Civilith, still standing frozen, still trapped in the graveyard of Sarah's memories. He looked at his fallen colleagues, their bodies twitching with the aftershocks of psychic trauma they had never been designed to endure. And he made a decision. He would not try to help Civilith escape. He was not strong enough, and attempting another connection would only drag him back into the abyss. But he could do something else, something that the Volthy had never done before. He could wait. He could stand guard over his people and wait for the human to wake up. And when she did, he would ask her, not demand, not take, but ask, to release Civilith from her mind. It was a small gesture, perhaps meaningless in the grand scheme of things. But as Korath settled into a chair and prepared to wait, he realized that small gestures were exactly what made humans so powerful. They did not need grand victories or cosmic triumphs. They just needed to help one person at a time, save one life at a time, carry one memory at a time. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. Sarah Chun opened her eyes. The light above her was too bright, the air smelled wrong, and her body felt like it had been through a meat grinder. These were all familiar sensations, the normal aftermath of a disaster. So she took a moment to assess her situation before trying to move. She was lying on some kind of medical table, surrounded by equipment she did not recognize. The walls were curved and metallic, clearly not human construction. And standing a few meters away, a creature with 4 eyes and gray skin was staring at her with an expression of pure exhaustion. "You are awake," the creature said, and Sarah noted with interest that she could understand him perfectly, probably some kind of translation technology. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice rough from disuse. "What happened to my ship? How long have I been unconscious?" The creature, Korath, a voice in the back of her mind whispered, and she remembered the gentle touch of his thoughts during the mental invasion. Stepped forward slowly, as if approaching a dangerous animal. "You are aboard the Volthy vessel Serenity of Thought," he said. "Your ship was damaged beyond repair. You have been unconscious for approximately 16 hours. And my people," he paused, his face twisting with something that looked like shame. "My people invaded your mind without your permission." Sarah sat up slowly, ignoring the protests of her aching muscles. She looked around the room and saw 3 unconscious aliens lying on the floor, their bodies occasionally twitching. She saw another alien weeping silently in the corner, rocking back and forth like a traumatized child. And she saw one more standing frozen near her feet, his 4 eyes vacant, his mouth moving in silent words. "Let me guess," she said, her tone flat. "You thought you would take a peek inside the primitive human's brain, see what makes us tick, maybe harvest some useful information." Korath flinched at her words, but did not look away. "Yes," he admitted. "That is exactly what we thought. We have done it to hundreds of species, and none of them ever posed a challenge. We believed humans would be the same, but we were not the same." "No," Korath whispered. "You were nothing like the same." Sarah swung her legs off the table and stood, pleased to find that her balance was steady despite everything. She walked over to the frozen alien and looked up into his vacant eyes. "This one went deepest," she said. "Not a question, but a statement. He is still in there, is he not?" "Still wandering through my memories, unable to find his way out." Korath nodded miserably. "High Mind Weaver Civilith is the most powerful telepath in our collective. He believed there was no mind he could not conquer. Your mind proved him wrong." Sarah studied Civilith's frozen face and felt a complicated mix of emotions swirl through her chest. On one hand, he had violated her without permission, had treated her like a specimen to be dissected. On the other hand, she knew exactly what he was experiencing right now, and she would not wish that on anyone. "He is in my graveyard," she said quietly. "The place where I keep everyone I could not save. He is surrounded by their faces, their voices, their final moments. And he does not understand how to carry that weight, because his species was never designed to carry anything. Can you help him?" Korath asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "Can you release him from your mind?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She could feel Civilith's presence in her subconscious like a splinter under her skin. Painful, irritating, but ultimately harmless. She could push him out easily if she wanted to, could close the door behind him and leave him with nothing but fragmented nightmares. But that would not be right. She reached out with her mind, following the connection back to where Civilith was trapped. She found him huddled in a corner of her mental graveyard, surrounded by ghosts he could not escape, overwhelmed by grief that was not his own. "Civilith," she said gently, and his consciousness flinched at the sound of her voice. "Look at me." His mental presence turned toward her, and she felt his terror, his confusion, his desperate desire to escape this nightmare and return to the clean, orderly world he had always known. "I cannot take these memories away from you," Sarah told him honestly. "What you have seen, what you have felt, that will stay with you forever. But I can show you how to carry it, how to let it strengthen you instead of crushing you. Why?" Civilith's voice was a broken whisper. "Why would you help me after what I did to you?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Because that is what humans do. We help even when we have every reason not to. We care, even when caring hurts. And we forgive, even when forgiveness seems impossible." She reached out her hand, not a physical hand, but a mental one, and waited. For a long moment, Civilith did not move. His entire worldview had been shattered. Everything he believed about the universe proved wrong. He had spent his entire life treating other minds as gardens to be plundered. And now he was faced with a mind that had welcomed him in, shown him its darkest corners, and was offering to guide him back to the light. Finally, slowly, he reached out and took her hand. Sarah pulled him out of the graveyard, through the layers of memory and trauma, past the screaming and the pain and the endless weight of a lifetime spent fighting death. And when Civilith finally opened his eyes in the physical world, he found himself looking up at the human woman he had tried to violate, and she was smiling at him with genuine warmth. "Welcome back," she said. Civilith fell to his knees, his body shaking with sobs he could not control. 300 cycles of emotional distance, of treating feelings as weaknesses to be suppressed. All of it crumbled in the face of what he had experienced. "I am sorry," he gasped. "I am so sorry. I did not know. I did not understand." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. No, she agreed. You did not. But now you do, and that is a start. She looked around the room at the broken mind-weavers, at the weeping alien in the corner, at Korath standing with tears streaming down his gray face. I am going to find my ship's emergency beacon and call for a rescue transport, she announced. You are going to let me leave without interference. And you are going to tell your collective that Earth is off limits. No more deep readings, no more mental invasions, no more treating humans like specimens. Korath nodded quickly. Yes, of course. I will personally ensure the message reaches our leadership. Good. Sarah walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at Civilith, who was still kneeling on the floor. The memories will fade with time, she told him. They will never disappear completely, but they will become easier to carry. And if you are lucky, really lucky, they might teach you something about what it means to be alive. She left the room, and the door closed behind her with a soft hiss. Korath helped Civilith to his feet and supported him as they both stared at the closed door. What did she show you? Korath asked quietly. Civilith shook his head, still trembling. Everything, he whispered. She showed me everything, and somehow, impossibly, she is still standing. She is still fighting. She is still saving lives. He turned to look at Korath with eyes that would never see the universe the same way again. We thought we were the superior species, he said. We were wrong. 6 months had passed since the incident aboard the Serenity of Thought, and the galaxy had not stopped talking about what happened. The Volthy Collective, once the undisputed masters of telepathic arts, had issued a formal declaration that sent shockwaves through every corner of known space. The document was short, barely 100 words, but its implications were staggering. Humanity is hereby classified as a Class Omega psychic hazard. Number deep readings are to be attempted on human subjects under any circumstances. No mental contact is to be initiated without explicit and informed consent. Violation of this directive will result in immediate expulsion from the collective. The declaration did not explain why. It did not mention the 7 mind-weavers who had been hospitalized after a single attempt to read one human mind. It did not describe the screaming that 3 of them still heard every night when they closed their eyes. It did not reveal that High Mind-Weaver Civilith, once the most powerful telepath in the collective, had resigned from his position and disappeared into self-imposed exile. But rumors spread anyway. In the taverns of the Merchant Coalition, traders whispered about the Deathworld species, whose minds were not gardens but graveyards. In the academies of the Scientific Consortium, researchers debated the evolutionary advantages of a species that processed trauma by carrying it instead of releasing it. And in the war rooms of a dozen military powers, strategists quietly updated their threat assessments to reflect a new and terrifying reality. Humans could not be interrogated. Not through traditional means, and certainly not through psychic ones. Their minds were fortresses built from pain and memory, and an iron will that refused to break. And anyone who tried to breach those walls would find themselves trapped inside, drowning in an ocean of emotion that no training could prepare them for. Korath learned of these rumors from the sanctuary of a small colony world where he had retreated after resigning from the Mindweaver caste. He could no longer perform deep readings. Every time he tried, he saw Sarah Chun's face, felt the weight of her memories pressing against his consciousness, and had to stop before the tears overwhelmed him. He had traded his robes for simple clothes, his titles for anonymity, and his certainty about the universe for a humility he had never known before. And he was not alone. Of the 7 Mindweavers who had participated in the failed deep reading, only 2 had returned to active duty. The rest had resigned, retired, or simply vanished. The experience had changed them in ways that could not be undone, had shown them a perspective on consciousness that their entire species had spent millennia trying to avoid. Korath spent his days working in a medical clinic, helping refugees from a dozen different species deal with injuries and illnesses. It was simple work, physical work, nothing like the mental gymnastics he had been trained for. But every time he helped someone, every time he saw relief flood a patient's eyes as their pain faded, he understood a little bit more of what Sarah Chun had tried to teach him. Service was not a weakness. It was the greatest strength. Caring was not a burden. It was a gift. And the memories of those you helped, even the ones you lost, were not weights to be discarded, but treasures to be cherished. One evening, as Korath was closing the clinic for the night, a message arrived on his personal terminal. The sender was anonymous, but the content made his heart skip several beats. I heard you left the Mindweavers. I heard you are helping people now. I thought you should know that I made it home. The rescue transport picked me up 3 days after I left your ship. I'm back at work, back to saving lives, back to adding new faces to my graveyard. Some of your colleagues have reached out to me through official channels, asking me to explain how humans do what we do. I have agreed to meet with them to help them understand. I do not know if it will make a difference, but I have to try. That is what humans do, after all. We try. Anyway, I wanted to thank you for being different. You asked permission, even when your leader did not. You waited for me to wake up. You treated me like a person instead of a specimen. Those small things mattered more than you know. Take care of yourself, Korath. The universe needs more people who are willing to feel. Sarah. Korath read the message 3 times, then 4, then 5. He thought about the human woman who had broken the minds of 7 Volthy telepaths without lifting a finger. He thought about the weight she carried every day, the impossible burden of 1,000 memories that she refused to release. He thought about the smile she had given Civilith even after everything he had done to her. And he finally understood. Humans were not dangerous because they were strong. They were dangerous because they were kind. Their compassion was not a weakness to be exploited, but a fire that burned anyone who tried to extinguish it. They cared about strangers they had never met. They sacrificed for people they would never see again. They carried the dead in their hearts and used that weight to fuel their determination to save the living. The Volthy had spent 12,000 cycles believing that emotional distance was the path to enlightenment. They have evolved to release pain, to let go of trauma, to move through the universe unburdened by the memories of those they had lost. But the humans took a different path. They embraced their pain, transformed it into purpose, and used it to build something the Volthy had never imagined possible. A species that refused to stop caring, no matter how much it hurt. Korath saved Sarah's message and turned off his terminal. Tomorrow, he would go back to the clinic and help more patients. He would feel their pain and share their relief. He would add their faces to a collection of memories that he was only beginning to learn how to carry. It would be hard. It would hurt. And some nights, he knew, the weight would feel unbearable. But he would keep going anyway. Because that was what Sarah Chun did. Because that was what all humans did. And if a primitive species from a Deathworld could carry that burden with grace and strength and an unbreakable will, then surely a Volthy could learn to do the same. Korath stepped out of the clinic and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, Sarah Chun was waking up to another day of disasters and death and desperate hope. She was putting on her uniform, checking her equipment, preparing to run toward danger while others ran away. She would save some lives and lose others. She would add new faces to her graveyard and new weights to her soul. And through it all, she would keep going, keep fighting, keep caring. Because giving up was not an option. Because every life mattered. Because that was what it meant to be human. Korath smiled for the first time in months. He still heard the cries when he slept, the echoes of Sarah's memories, the voices of all those she had tried to save. But now, instead of fearing them, he listened to them. They were not a curse. They were a reminder. And every morning, when he woke up and went back to work, they gave him the strength to try one more time.